Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. The passage we're going to look at today, one of two, is this one. This is the first of two passages. Expose not someone's shortcomings and boast not of one's strengths. So this isn't a difficult concept to get our heads around. We shouldn't, the Exalted Treatise here is telling us not to expose or disclose of the shortcomings of others and not to boast of our own strengths. Now, if we look a little bit deeper at the original Chinese, the character for expose certainly means to disclose, but it's not limited to just talking about it. It's not limited to disclosing through our words. It could be through any form of media, be it written, electronic, even social media. Not exposing someone's shortcomings. What do we mean by that? Shortcomings in this context refers to someone's inferior skill or ability. And I mean, if you think about it, if you take two people, A and B, you draw a comparison. Well, obviously, in some areas, maybe A will do better than B. So automatically, B will have, relatively speaking, some shortcomings. So it's an inferior ability, competence, or skill. Then at the same time, the Exalted Treatise alerts us to not boast, show off or flaunt our strengths. And these strengths correspond to, their superior abilities, talents. It could be even doing things in a better way, more efficiently, more effectively. So idea is not to talk about or not to disclose about someone's shortcomings and not to boast of our own strengths. And you might think, well, actually, yes, it's certainly poor form to go around boasting of oneself or, criticizing others. But how might it be a misdeed? I'll just pause for a second, this sharing, just back. Now, why is it particularly known as a misdeed? Well, if you think about it, it can be our words. Let's just take the first part of the sentence, exposing someone's shortcomings. Well, our words can be very detrimental and damaging on at least two levels. Firstly, the person who's being talked about, obviously the person doing the talking, disparaging, criticizing, doesn't care about the damage, detriment to that person's reputation. And, they don't have to be someone famous, but, their reputation in terms of what the people around them might think of them or their character. And it could well have ramifications for their job, their business, even their family relationships. So it can be personally quite detrimental. That's one aspect. But more than that, anyone who hears about those words, whether they really know that person being disparaged or not, there's sort of damage and detriment on a broader level because anyone who hears about it, sort of the wider community, suffers. They suffer because attention is being drawn to the negative examples. The negative examples, someone's shortcomings, are being given airtime and, doesn't help anyone, doesn't benefit anyone at all. So, some people like to think that, they are being funny, they're making a joke at someone's expense, or they feel that by criticizing others, putting someone down, it makes them look better. But actually, it's very harmful, not just to that person who's being talked about, but to the community more broadly. And it also reflects poorly on the person criticizing. in exposing another person's shortcomings. So it sort of everyone loses. Now I've chosen 3 accounts from what's known as, it's a set of books known as the Collectania on the Tao, or on the way, and its virtue. And it's a set of 15 books. Let me just share the screen again. The first account comes from volume 7, and it's about, virtuous conduct that happens in the community from all people from all walks of life. And this particular instance relates to a poet by the name of Zhang Qi, and he had this extraordinary talent for writing poetry. He was really good at it. Unfortunately, his personality was such that he liked to mock, ridicule others, anyone. And in fact, each and every poem that he wrote, he would focus in a lot of detail on exposing the shortcomings of others. And he would do so. Unfortunately, that is clearly, considered to be a misdeed, as highlighted by the Exalted Treatise. And what happened to him? Well, it's recorded that he came down with a terrible disease. All of his teeth fell out and he died. So not a very happy ending. And we can see how, this misconduct is sort of directly related to his misfortunes. In those days, poetry, not everyone could read or write, not everyone was literate. And poetry was written and it would be read out aloud. Sometimes it could even be sung. And, there's a direct correspondence. Why did all of his teeth fall out? Well, it was obviously to stop him from, reading out his poetry to others. And not a very happy ending. It sort of highlights the dangers of satirical works, especially or similar works done with a malicious intent. So, writing good poetry takes a lot of skill. Unfortunately, the skill was applied in the wrong way. And sort of created misfortune for Zhang Ti himself. There's a happier example in the next account, and it relates to one of Confucius's best students. You might have heard of the student. His name is Min Sun, also known as Min Ziqian. And he lived in around the 4th century before the Common Era. And, when he was young, he lost his mother. His mother passed away when he was still a very young boy. And his father remarried, so he had a stepmother. And later on, his stepmother had 2 sons. So he ended up with 2 younger stepbrothers. Now, unfortunately, his stepmother treated him rather badly. For example, in the wintertime, when it was sort of freezing cold, it would be snowing outside, the stepmother would, she would make clothes for her sons, all 3 of them, but her own sons, she would line the winter clothes with what's known as cotton fibers to ensure that it would be insulating, keep them warm. But for Min Ziqian, her stepson, she would, make his clothes, but line them with reed flowers. So they would be puffy. And, from the outside, it looked, just like any other puffy, warm jacket. But it had no insulating property at all. So he would still be very cold. And one time, also during the winter, Min Ziqian was driving a carriage for his father, sitting at the back. He was shivering. It got so cold. It was freezing cold, it was snowing, and it got so cold that he lost the reins, basically lost control of the carriage. Now, when his father discovered, his father was thought it strange. He's wearing these warm clothes, the puffy clothes. Should have been warm. Why was he like that? That's very unlike his son. And when the truth of the matter came out, you can imagine how furious his father was with the stepmother. In fact, he even wanted to throw her out of the house, had nothing to do with her again, for mistreating his son, Min Ziqian. But it's at this point that Min Ziqian sort of speaks out. All this time, you could say his stepmother was not really doing her duty as a parent, as a mother for him, but he had never complained. So he never once spoke out about her shortcomings. And it's when his father gets really angry, he realizes how the stepmother has been treating Min Ziqian, that Min Ziqian sort of speaks out and sort of encourages his father to think again, to not go through with this rash decision. He reasons with his father and he explains that, look, with stepmother here at home, only one son suffers. But without her, all three sons will be motherless. So, throughout all this time, what's at the forefront of Min Ziqian's mind is not his own comfort and self-interest, but he thought about the family, keeping the family together, ensuring that there was harmony and happiness for everyone in the family. And so, he convinced his father to let his wife remain. And what he said really moved his stepmother, and it's recorded that she was so moved that from that time onwards, she never mistreated him again. So it shows the power of the good deed in not exposing someone's shortcomings. It really gives them that space to improve, to change for the better. And so we can see that certainly has a happy ending for the whole family. Now, the next account comes from this is from volume 4. The next account comes from volume 3. And this is a particular volume dedicated to good virtuous conduct within the family. And in each volume, there are positive exemplars and negative exemplars. This relates to a man by the name of Liu Zhongfu. He comes from Macheng, a county city in Hubei province in China. And he was very poor, came from a poor background, but from a very young age, Mr. Liu was a very kind and considerate person. Now, one night, he was a young man at the time, he'd just been married. He's woken up by the sounds of a thief in his room. And he's completely shocked. In the dark of the night, he sort of makes out that the thief is just a boy. And it seems to be, someone he might know. So he, feels really sorry that this young boy has to resort to crime and stealing. And so what he does is, he just, takes some of his wife's, could be hairpins or accessories, things that might have been of some value, and he gives it to the boy thief, and he tells him, look, you have to change what you do for a living. Take these, change what you do for a living, and I will not breathe a word of this incident to anyone. So it sort of gives him some motivation to stop stealing and stop this crime. And his wife wakes up and the next morning asks him, who was this intruder? But Mr. Liu doesn't say. He said, look, he's given his word not to tell anyone. And, over the years, from time to time, his wife is curious and asks him, but the reply remains the same. So Mr. Liu keeps his word. And it said that he lived until the age of, he had a very long life. He lived until the age of 89. And every year of his life, then on, there would be good fortune. Sort of times got better and better. In fact, his children did very well. They passed the civil service examinations to become government officials, and his grandchildren were able to do the same. So sort of the whole family, the fortunes of the whole family were turned around. He'd been poor to begin with, but having his children, his grandchildren, they would have prominent social standing within the community, financial security with these government roles. You can see how the whole fortunes of the family have been turned around. And it said that, he had this long life, year after year of good fortune. Now, at his funeral, it's noted that his nephew was particularly grief-stricken. And his nephew is someone who is well known in the community for his commitment to doing good deeds. So sort of reading between the lines, it said that it's probably his nephew who broke into the house in all that time, a long time ago. But we can see that by not exposing that boy, whether it's his nephew or not, by giving, it's probably his nephew because that's the way it's reported in the book, by not reporting on the thief immediately to the authorities, giving the nephew chance to change, urging him to change. You can see that Mr. Liu had some part in turning the life of the boy around. You could see in doing so, you could say that he had some part in all of the good deeds that the boy did. The young man did from then on. So it is probably no accident that his own fortunes got improved. His family's good fortunes also improved. So it's a really happy ending, and it shows, another example of this good deed of not exposing someone's shortcomings, really giving them that opportunity to change their ways. Now, you might ask, well, is it ever okay to talk about someone's shortcomings? The answer is, well, yes, there are certain times when it would be okay. For example, when we're giving constructive feedback, we could be in the role of a mentor, a teacher, a good friend, and we really want to help that person to improve. So, these days when you're reviewing someone's work, it could be an essay, it could be, what they've done in the workplace. You might have heard of 360-degree appraisals that are done on an annual basis in certain professions, where everyone in that organisation can contribute to a particular employee's review, you could say. And I think giving feedback, ideally, it should be one-on-one in private. That person, sometimes it's hard to know. They don't call blind spots for no reason. But sometimes, people will be aware of their shortcomings. They're just not sure how to change. And so it can be very helpful if you have that heart of caring, really concerned about that person, wanting to help them change. Well, you can give them constructive feedback. You can point out their shortcomings, and they'll be very grateful for you in doing so if you ensure that it's done, not in public, but one-on-one, and with that sort of sincere concern for them. it boils down very much to our intentions at the end of the day. Now, what happens if we're on the receiving end of criticism, where someone's pointed out our shortcomings? Well, obviously it's not ideal if they do that in front of others, but in the heat of the moment, they might. It could be an urgent situation. That's their misdeed if they expose, publicly disclose someone's shortcomings. But if we're on the receiving end, I think it's important to always be grateful, because someone has taken the time to point out to us what we need to improve on, and help us to be a little bit clearer on what needs to be improved on and how to improve. And I think that even if they have said something wrong, even if they pointed to a shortcoming that we don't have, they're completely mistaken. There's no harm in sort of accepting that, and accepting that as a bit of a reminder, to ensure that we don't make that mistake in the future. We haven't made that mistake to date, but that doesn't mean that we're guaranteed to be faultless. And having an extra reminder can only be helpful. So I suggest the best way of receiving feedback is always to be grateful. That really helps us to reflect on whether we have that shortcoming, that fault that needs to be corrected. And yeah, I think that can only be helpful if we're on the receiving end. On the giving end, we want to make sure that it's in private, one-on-one, and we do that with a heart of caring and consideration for that person. So that's in relation to not exposing someone's shortcomings. What about the other part of the equation? Boasting about one's own strengths, what we do well. Well, obviously, it's poor form to blow our own trumpet, as they say. But why would it count as a misdeed? Isn't that sort of an overreaction? Why would it be singled out here in the Exalted Treatise, a very small, thin text, as a misdeed in itself, to boast of oneself? I mean, what sort of harm could that come to? Well, the Exalted Treatise, as we mentioned previously, is a foundational text of the Taoist tradition of thought. You can think of that as the beginner's level. But when we turn to one of the earliest texts ascribed to this Taoist tradition, what's known as the Laozi or the Tao Te Ching, it has two names in Chinese, and it sort of translates as into Master Lao, or the classic of the way and its virtue. If we look into the text, let me speak about it broadly. It's one of the most translated works of Chinese literature, and it was one of the earliest texts that sort of founded the Taoist tradition of thought. And the core idea, it centers on the idea of the natural harmony in nature, or what they would refer to as heaven and earth, and the harmony in the way things operate, how things move, change in that natural world, finding the patterns, you say, the natural patterns of nature, the workings, the way it works in the natural world, as standards and principles for happiness and harmony in human living. So it's been called a natural philosophy for living. And the idea of, I can share my screen and put an extract from the Laozi. Yeah, this is one English translation. And it talks about withdrawing oneself when the work is done, one's name is established, accords with the way of heaven, the way of nature. What it's saying here is that, maintaining restraint when we've achieved success and we've achieved recognition. We want to withdraw oneself. Now, to understand a little bit further, there's an interesting anecdote that involves Confucius and his students in an ancient vessel. I've got a little bit of a picture here. This is sort of an artwork that's done on a silk scroll and dates from the Ming Dynasty, so around the 16th century. And as the story goes, Confucius is visiting the temple commemorating one of the rulers of his state, the state of Lu. The ruler is called Lord Huan, and he ruled in the state in around the 6th century before the Common Era, so many, many years ago. So Confucius and his some students come along with him to this temple, and he notices a particular vessel. It's a rather old vessel, rare, not often seen, and Confucius asks one of the students to fetch some water, and he pours the water into the vessel, and the vessel is shaped like so. When he pours the water up to about halfway, the vessel is upright, as you can see, in the middle of this painting. But when it is filled to the brim, the vessel topples over, and the water sort of all comes out. And it's at this point that Confucius's expression changes, and he sort of exclaims that, this is incredible. It gives us a really great illustration of the importance, significance of the idea of fullness. Now, fullness is sort of a notion that is, found in the Taoist tradition of thought. And this anecdote appears in several books, Huainanzi being one of them, as I've quoted from here. So his student is quite curious. One of his students asks Confucius, "What do you mean by this fullness? What do you mean? How is it important?" And Confucius replies very briefly. He says, what increases will decrease. And then the student, Zagong, in this particular instance, sort of says, "Well, what do you mean?" Still not very clear. So Confucius replied, things that prosper will reach a point where they decline. For example, like joy, that in its extreme turns to sorrow. How does that work? How can you be happy to the extreme at your happiest and then, become extremely sad? Well, to take an everyday example, when you're eating and you eat too much, that feeling of satisfaction, we're not talking, doesn't have to be your favorite food, but let's say you eat too much of anything, the feeling of satisfaction quickly turns to discomfort, doesn't it? So this is one example of joy in its extreme turning to sorrow. Then the next two examples, the sun, when it reaches midday, the full height, then starts to go down. As we say, the sun sets. Or the moon, when it becomes a full moon, it will start to wane. So these are sort of natural patterns that is readily observable in the world around us. Now, that is why Confucius goes on to explain that those who are perceptive, who are wise, they preserve themselves with what's been translated as stupidity. And it doesn't mean that they pretend to be foolish, but there's always more to learn. And so they maintain that sense of humility to know more, seek to continue seeking to learn from others. So they preserve themselves. The learned, the eloquent, people who know a lot, who can speak very well, they preserve themselves with restraint. They'll choose when it is appropriate to speak up, and when it might be better to remain silent. Those who are martial, belligerent, and courageous, they preserve themselves with timidity. Are they really afraid? No, but they're very cautious in maybe planning, strategizing how they go about military expeditions or, those activities. The wealthy and the powerful would preserve themselves with frugality, being economical with themselves to maintain their wealth, and to be able to be in a position to be generous in helping others, or being prepared against the worst case scenarios. In those days there were insurance policies, and those with potency whose potency operates throughout the empire, preserve themselves with docility, being understanding, listening to others. If you imagine, you're so powerful that all of the empire sort of has to listen to your authority, abide by your rules. The person, a king, the ruler would preserve themselves by ensuring that they take into account the needs of the people, to ensure that they listen to what they're concerned about, what's happening, keeping in touch and in tune with what's happening in their lives, what are their pressures. So these 5 things are the means by which the former kings, former great rulers, defended their empires without losing them. If you act against these 5 things, you will always be endangered. And the text here cites the Lao, Master Lao, saying that those who possess the way, who accord with the Tao, accord with the way of heaven and earth, do not try to fill themselves to the brim. And because they don't try to fill themselves to the brim, well, they're like a garment that endures all wear and tear, and it always remains sort of new. It doesn't need to be renewed. You're preserved against the perils of overdoing things. Now, in terms of, I'll just stop presenting slides, but this idea of fullness in terms of human affairs, it translates to arrogance, complacency. We might say, describe someone as being full of themselves. And what's wrong with that? Well, it stops being arrogant, being complacent. It stops us from seeing the strengths of others, it stops us learning from others. We're so busy thinking about how great we are. It stops us from feeling grateful for the efforts of others to, the input, their contributions of anybody else, because we think that we're the be-all and end-all. And ultimately, it stops us in terms of improving, whether it's our skills or abilities, or improving in our cultivation of good character. So that's why it's quite damaging, this fullness. And I'm sure we all know what it feels like to be in the presence of a know-it-all. So how do we accord with the Tao? Well, as we read in the Lao Tzu before, it's the idea of showing restraint, withdrawing. Withdrawing doesn't mean giving up our responsibilities, giving up our roles, abandoning, avoiding responsibilities, or hiding away. What it means is not boasting, not flaunting our skills or our talents, and sort of internally not dwelling on the outcomes we've achieved. And there are really good reasons for not doing so. Because if you think about it, how much of my success or any person's success is really due to their own efforts. We ask ourselves, would it have been possible without the support of my parents, my family members, my friends, not to mention, teachers or mentors or colleagues throughout the years, or the experiences that I might have had the good fortune to have, things that I might have seen and learned from, would I have been able to achieve without, all of the above? And, when you think about it, yes, of course, we can have innovative ideas, we can have inspiration, but that original contribution often happens based on the contributions of everyone who's come before us, whether that's in a particular field of knowledge or learning or an area of expertise. So, and when we say not dwelling on what we've achieved, notice that, achieved is in the past tense. Yes, we've already done certain things. We've already accomplished certain things. But those things don't mean all that much if we're not really using our accomplishments, our skills, etc., to make a meaningful contribution to the people around us. As I say, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And you show that, how much you care, by serving others, applying whatever we can do in service of others. So these are really good reasons why it's considered a misdeed to boast of oneself and our strengths. Now, is it ever okay to talk about what we're good at, what we can do? Well, yes, there are certain instances. You think about applying for a job, going for a job interview, or putting together the application letter and our CV. It's fine if we are able to give specific examples to back up our claims. We want to avoid sweeping generalizations or exaggerations in what we say and write. So another scenario is if you've ever listened to a keynote speech, the speaker, the presenter might begin their talk by sharing about their experience or expertise. Are they boasting about themselves? Or I would say that most of the time it's to help the audience understand and sort of appreciate the fact that what they will be presenting on, sort of give the audience confidence in listening and learning from what they're about to present on. So in certain circumstances, it's completely reasonable, and you'd be well within your rights to talk about your strengths and what you can do. But notice that it's also boils down to your intentions. You're telling people to give them confidence, bring them some benefit, and not, sort of highlighting yourself for the sake of it. So that's really important to remember. Now, that's in relation to not exposing another person's shortcomings and not boasting of our own strengths. The next passage is, I'll share that. Curb wrongdoings and promote goodness. That's the first part of the next passage. To curb wrongdoings and promote goodness. It sounds pretty obvious or intuitive. This idea of curbing is to obviously prevent, discourage, and try to bring an end to misdeeds. The idea is to prevent others from committing more or worse misdeeds. It's a slippery slope sometimes. So by promoting goodness, these are good deeds, we want to be praising, encouraging, rewarding, recognizing, and supporting people who are undertaking good works. Now, you might think it sounds a little bit similar to the passage we've just read. Now, it's different from the previous statement because, it's about strengths and shortcomings, how a person interacts with others, how they respond to someone's, weaknesses, what they're not so good at, and how they should, the right attitude in relation to their own, what they might perceive as their own strengths. But this particular passage looks at how a person responds to the good conduct and the misconduct of others. So they're not the ones doing the good deeds or the misdeeds, but this is how they should be responding. These are good deeds that you can do. And I'd like to share a couple of accounts, again, from the Collectania on the way and its virtue. And the first relates to a fiction writer, so an author by the name of Mr. Zhang. We don't have too many identifying details because they'll soon become clear, but he was extraordinarily talented. He would write and compile these novels. He would even publish and sell these books, works of fiction. And he thought, it was creative writing, pure fantasy, completely harmless, right? But one night he has a dream, and he dreams of his late father. And his late father scolds him in the dream and makes several points in no uncertain terms. First of all, he points out to his son, Mr. Zhang, that all that you print is making the readers bedazzled, leaves them in a daze, even confuses and misleads them as to reality. And in fact, it has prevented many people, the people who buy your books and read your books, prevented them from really having that clarity of thought to reflect on themselves. And as people would generally do in those days, to improve their ethical character. So reading his books, these books of fiction, these stories or whatever, would take up a lot of their time. They would end up feeling a bit dazed, a bit confused, and would stop them from really reflecting on themselves and making better use of their time. Now, the second point is that the spirits that oversee such matters will be sort of administering the worst punishments. This sort of might remind us of the early passages of the Exalted Treatise, where it tells us about spirit lords in our home, like the kitchen god, in our bodies, or those above us, keeping record of all of our good deeds and misdeeds to ensure that we get the good fortune that we deserve and the punishments that we should suffer. So his father tells him, the spirits that have already recorded this, they know about this already, and they will be administering the worst, the harshest punishments. And originally you had a really bright future. You were destined for a very long life. You had great good fortune to look forward to, but unfortunately all of that has been depleted by your misconduct, your misdeeds. And, again, we're reminded by earlier passages in the Exalted Treatise that, these spirits, they keep track of what we do, what we think, say, and do, and they will, maybe, depending on the gravity of our offences, reduce our lifespans from units of 100 days to 12 years. So his father, in Mr. Zhang's dream, tells him that he can expect to be punished. And what's more, the ancestors who've worked so hard to accumulate the merits and the good fortunes over so many generations, are now, all that good fortune has been lost by in his own hands. So here was someone, he had a great future, lots of good fortune to look forward to, and he's completely depleted that good fortune. And his father says, you think that what you're doing is completely harmless. This really the first time that Mr. Zhang sort of realizes that the error of his ways. You could call it, a wake-up call. And he wakes up in a state of shock. He's completely remorseful for what he's done. Was it just a dream? Well, actually, no. It really takes it seriously, makes him realize that his way of earning a living, you could say, going about this business is it's been wrong. But unfortunately, as you imagine, the books have been sold, they've been published, they've been sold, they've been read, and the damage is already done. And so not too long after Mr. Zhang has that dream, his whole family drowns. And that's actually the title of this account. An entire family drowns. Now, you might think, seems terrible. Why did his whole family have to suffer from, the misdeeds of the one family member? Well, if you think about it, he sold his books, obviously, to more than one person. So the readers that were impacted, but not just the readers. If you think about all the ancestors who've worked so hard to accumulate the good fortune that has been literally squandered by Mr. Zhang. He should have been making his ancestors proud by cultivating more good fortune for himself and his family, his future generations. But it's sort of completely overturned all of their efforts. And so, there is a misdeed in not living in honor of their contributions. So you can understand why his misfortune sort of affected the whole family, more than one person. And if you think about it, Mr. Zhang was very fortunate. He had the resources to publish what he wrote. He sold them, so obviously he had his readers, had his fans, you could say. Was earning an income from his great talent. But unfortunately, he sort of applied the talent to create misfortune for himself instead of cultivating further good fortune. So it's a real shame that he didn't apply his talents to better use. Now, there's another account from the same volume, and it relates to Mr. Li. And he was a storyteller from Hangzhou province in China. And, a storyteller in those days was a bit of an art form. Many people in the community might not have been able to read and write. And so in their spare time, they would gather around to listen to stories. That was the way they could be entertained. There weren't any TVs, for example. And but more than that, it was a way that people in the community, young and old, could be educated. Now, Mr. Li, what was special about his storytelling was that he loved to tell stories about cause and effect. Whenever he encountered sort of parts that were indecent or obscene, he would skip over those. And he basically used the stories that he told to help others learn to cultivate their good ethical character. And so, some people might say, well, wouldn't those stories be really boring? No wild parts. How could he have made any money? Who would listen to him? Well, actually, his business prospered. This art of storytelling would be set to music, and it would be a bit of a performance. And his business actually prospered. Many people loved, obviously, listening to and benefited from his stories. And what happened to him, his business prospered. He was able to have a son later on in his life. His son was intelligent, very talented, passed the civil service examinations at a very young age, and ended up being a government official. So having that high, prominent social standing within the community and really being in a position to make a positive difference to the community as a whole. So, that wasn't an accident, but as you can see how Mr. Lee cultivated the good fortune, the good deeds, by sort of curbing wrongdoing, skipping over the parts with negative examples, the harmful parts of these stories, and really promoting goodness, helping more people to understand that their future, their destinies really lies in their own hands. Whether they enjoy good fortune or suffer misfortune really relates to what they think, say, and do, their day-to-day conduct. And his example, I suppose, really alerts us to the fact that by being a bit selective in what he shared, he was able to avoid popularizing the negative examples. Sometimes you hear a really shocking story, shocks you for the first maybe few times, but the more you hear about these things, it becomes normalized, so much so that people can, find it hard to tell the difference between what is good conduct and what is misconduct, what might be good deeds or misdeeds. So it sort of blurs the boundaries. And by being selective, he obviously saved people from, from those negative examples being popularized and harmful to the individuals who listened to him, but also more, the community benefited as a whole. So those two examples show us that in whatever role, whatever career, or in whatever capacity, everyone can do something to curb wrongdoing and to promote goodness. Now, promoting goodness, accentuating the positive. Stop sharing for a little bit. What are the benefits of accentuating the positive? There are two main benefits, and I'm sure maybe you can think of some more. But the first thing is that for those people who are, undertaking some good deeds or starting to do so, it really gives them encouragement to continue on the right track, and gives them confidence that what they're doing is right as well, so that they're doing the right thing. That's really important. That sort of confirmation. But for other people who might not be engaged in similar good deeds, well, when they hear about it, it's very educational. They learn about positive examples, positive role models, and they're guided in the right direction, ultimately. So they're able to learn from the strengths of others. So you could say that it is through through us, that those two groups of people are able to do good and do more, either start to do good deeds or do more good deeds. So we're helping, literally helping others do good deeds or doing good deeds with them. You can think of it as such. So hence it is a good deed in itself to promote goodness and obviously curbing wrongdoing. Now, there's just two further examples, mindful of the time. Two further examples I'd like to share with you very quickly. One relates to King Shun. But before he became one of the legendary emperors of ancient China, there was a time when he lived by riverside, and he earned his living as a fisherman. But he noticed that, that within the community, everyone would be competing over, vying over the best fishing grounds. And the worst spots, where the waters were shallow or the flow of the water was very fast, there'd be fewer fish, and those worst spots would generally be left to the elderly fishermen. But after Schwinn lived there for about a year, things changed about 180 degrees. Lots of the young and able-bodied fishermen would voluntarily give up the best fishing spots for the elderly fishermen. So what did he do to bring about that change? Well, he certainly didn't give those fishermen a good talking to, didn't give them a lecture, didn't report on their selfish conduct to maybe the authorities or penalize them in any way. What he did was he praised them whenever they did the right thing. And in doing so, basically sort of highlighted the significance of their good deeds. They were the importance of showing respect and care for the elderly around us. And so obviously, more people came to know about those good deeds. They learned about it. And, basically the community, all the people in that community emulated the good deeds of others. And so brought about change on a community level. Just the one person praising the good conduct of others. The second example sharing, relates to a private tutor. We don't know his name in particular, but he comes from Xiuning County in China. And he was poor, came from a very poor background, but he studied hard. And he became a private tutor in the sense of being, in those days, children wouldn't go to primary school, for example. They would be tutored within their family school. So tutors would be employed and they would teach all of the children, the grandchildren of that particular family. So it's recorded that he tries to borrow some money from one of the wealthiest men in the village, but never gets a response. So he's denied a loan. And later on, this wealthy man passes away. He's survived by two sons. His two sons are in a dispute with each other over the family estate and property. And the eldest son comes to this tutor asking him to, he's the tutor being a very educated man, to write up a petition, basically start a claim, to start law proceedings against his brother. He wants to litigate his brother over this family property. And the tutor says, well, I've read some law back in years ago, and I've even determined some disputes, but I'm not really in a position to help you. In fact, the tutor sort of helps the elder brother understand, the relationship between siblings, as we covered earlier in an earlier passage. Older siblings have to love and care for the younger siblings. The younger siblings should love and respect their older siblings. So the older sibling, comes away, realizes that, explains that, by going through with this dispute, you'll both be losing. Imagine the legal fees involved and all the hassle, the stress, everything. And your relationship with your brother could be irrevocably, torn apart. And so he goes away and he decides not to go ahead. But later on, the younger brother approaches the same tutor, asking for help to sue his older brother. And again, he sort of counsels the younger brother to realize actually that's really not a good idea at all. And the young brother goes back and is more motivated to sort of restore this relationship he has with his older brother. And it's recorded that the two of them were able to remain on good terms. It keeps the family together and keeps the wealth in the family, and they remain wealthy. So, if you think about it, the tutor could have easily drawn up the documents, made money, from both sides. He had come from a poor background, but he recognised, the worth of the family bond. There are some things that are priceless that money cannot replace. And by doing so, it's recorded that he was later blessed with 2 sons, and both the sons did very well in the civil service examinations. So they excelled, they went on to have careers in the government service. And you can see that it's a really good example of how, as a tutor, he was able to encourage people to stop, nip things in the bud in terms of the wrongdoing, misconduct. That's not the way siblings should treat each other, and promote goodness in terms of harmony within the family, forgiving each other, and really both sides making that attempt to get along. So restoring the relationship between the siblings within a family and keeping as a family together. So that sort of brings us to close of the first part of this passage, curb wrongdoings and promote goodness. And I hope that it's giving you some food for thought. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.